Kyle Whittingham said Utah might not be done adding talent to their quarterback room. They could be looking in the transfer portal. We're talking about his comments and all the latest from Utah spring football on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you may get your podcast. If it's your first time listening to our show, make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all of you in the YouTube comments as well as on social media, where you can follow our show at Locked On Utes on X. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs help you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. All caps, no spaces. Locked On College. Terms and conditions do apply. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. And on today's show, talking about all the latest from Utah spring ball. We're going to close on Utah Gymnastics setting an NCAA record. You guys don't want to miss the end when we do go over that. But first, have to talk about the latest comments by Kyle Whittingham, who, of course, after Tuesday's practice, as he's done throughout the duration of spring ball, speaks to the media. And he gave us a juicy quote. This one comes to us from KSL.com's Josh Furlong, friend of the show, who said that Whittingham, when asked on whether they will go to the transfer portal to add another quarterback, said, "We'll see. They'll evaluate spring once it's finalized and look to the portal when it opens next week to see what they need to do." Kyle Whittingham said it's very possible we may be in the market. Once again, that comes to us from Josh Furlong. And my reaction to that is I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that he's at least saying we're going to kick the tires and see what's out there. You never want to eliminate yourself from the chance to get better, right? And that's where, as I'm going to mention in a moment, I think this Utah quarterback room is pretty stout. But you never know what's going to be out there. You're always looking to improve and get better. And Utah should definitely be as well. So I'm not surprised that he said it's very possible we'll be in the market. But there's two reasons I don't expect Utah to add a major impact quarterback in the transfer portal, at least not one that will spice up the backup quarterback battle, as some of you may be hoping. And I think the biggest reason is, if you are in the transfer portal, it's because you are looking to get playing time. That's why guys leave their situations. More than likely, it's to leave and go get playing time somewhere else. If you're going to Utah, yes, you can have a chance to play in 2025. But as it pertains to 2024, it all just depends if Cam Rising gets injured. But obviously, you don't plan and factor on. You have to have contingency plans in place. But if I was a quarterback transferring and I was like, I want to be a starter or have a chance to play in 2024, I'm not coming to Utah where Cam Rising was just named. I can't remember the name of the ESPN list off the top of my head, but I just saw the other day that he was ranked as one of the 10 best returning quarterbacks, or just one of the 10 best quarterbacks in college football for this coming season. Something we'll definitely talk about on a later episode of Locked On Utes, and something I do think is absolutely a good ranking. But like, that's what you're coming into. A guy who's won back-to-back conference championships. Like, you're not beating out Cam Rising for the job. So then it's at best is, okay, I can be the backup quarterback and get a head start on everyone else. But I once again say, do you really want to sit, wait a year rather, and then fight for the job? Because it's not going to be given to you. You're still going to have to fend off Isaac Wilson, Brandon Rose, potentially too. So if that's the case, wouldn't you rather just go somewhere where you can play right away? So I think the caliber of quarterback that's going to be competing with Rose and Wilson for the backup, just in the transfer portal, I don't expect them to come to Utah, at least not in this year's cycle. Maybe next year's one of them will come in if after Cam leaves and the job is open, but I don't see why you would waste a year of eligibility more than likely. And yes, maybe you could play and be a backup quarterback. And the other reason I'll say that I don't feel like this is crazy likely is I think that Utah's quarterback room is in a pretty good place. And I'm sure some of you are like, oh, that's crazy. You saw how bad it went last year after Cam went down. But let's be honest once again about like what a backup quarterback is supposed to be. A backup quarterback is supposed to be able to win you tough games. You know, you're not going to play the level of the starter, win a couple tough games, excuse me, is what I meant to say. So win a couple of tough games, keep the offense afloat and do some things, but you're not going to be as effective because he's a backup quarterback. If he was a starter, he'd probably be in another Power 5 team starting because he would have transferred and all the things that go into that. Like very few teams, obviously Fafita and Arizona were the exception last year, right? When Jaden Delora got hurt, like there's just not many teams that when their starter goes down, they get the same level of play. That's just not really how you look across the college football landscape. That's not really how it works. So if we look back to last year and what Bryson Barnes and Nate Johnson were able to do, right? They helped Utah win a lot of the games that they were supposed to, and even ones where you're like, oh, how's that going to go? The Florida game, right? Utah musters 24 points. Yes, a lot of that was the defense, but once again, when your backup quarterback is in, he's a backup for a reason. If these guys were starters right now at this moment at the Power 4 level, they would be somewhere else. So it was great to see them come in, help Utah get the win against Florida. Yes, Bryson Barnes really struggled against Baylor. That's where Nate Johnson stepped up and helped them get the win. The Utah offense was abysmal against UCLA, but they managed to get one touchdown drive out of it, move the ball in some other spots to help put the defense in a good position to stop the Bruins, helped Utah get a win there. Lost to Oregon State. That was a top 20 loss on the road with backup quarterbacks. Once again, that's one, if you told me going into the season that Utah would have their backup quarterbacks, a loss at Oregon State was going to be hard with Cam Rising, let alone a backup quarterback. Utah won the game they were supposed to against Cal, of course. Then you go to USC. That was a top 20 game at the time. That's another game where it's like, had you told me going into the season that Utah would have a backup quarterback, would have said they were going to lose. But that's what's nice about a really good backup, as Bryson and Nate in stretches proved to be, right? Is that you can come in, have a performance, have a game. Your consistency is not going to be with the starters, the level that the starters play at, right? But you can come in, make an impact, make a play, and do enough to be part of the reason your team wins. You're never going to put the team completely on your back. That's just not really what backups do. Look across the college football landscape, I'll say again. And then you go on there for Utah's schedule, right? Yes, they lost at home against Oregon. Even if Cam played, that would have been an extremely tough game. I know how good Utah is at home, but trust me, we've talked about it a lot on this show. But that Oregon team led by Bo Nix was also special. Would have been a tough game. Utah, of course, would also go on to lose to Washington later in the season. We saw the Huskies only lost one game in the national championship. And even in that loss, Bryson actually played pretty well and did some nice things. Yes, I think he might have had a pick six, if I do remember correctly, in that one. But he made a number of nice throws and plays too. And obviously Utah's defense gave up 35 points. So that's never going to be ideal. And then you lose to Arizona, right? That's the one where it's like, okay, backup quarterback is not going to have his best game. And I mean, let's just call it what it is. Utah didn't have their best game that day. So that's just looking back on last year and the level the backup quarterbacks played at, which was actually pretty good for Utah overall when you consider all things. Yes, the bowl game was awful. Bryson was not good. It was a mess, but that really wasn't indicative of what the actual season was for the backup quarterbacks. And I talked a lot about Bryson and not the guys they have in the room. Well, who was Bryson competing with last spring? It was Brandon Rose. What did Brandon Rose do? Beat him out during the spring. Now, I've said several times on the show that I believe Bryson Barnes still would have been the starter even if Brandon Rose had stayed healthy. But guess what? They were close then, and Brandon had already made gradual leaps, and he was younger in the program versus Bryson was a little more seasoned than him, right? I believe that Brandon, had Bryson stayed, would have beaten him out because they were close last year. Brandon Rose being the younger guy, I believe his improvements and strides would help him be better. Kyle Whittingham, in another quote from Up on the Hill, said, that came to us from Josh Furlong too, said that this is some of the best football that Brandon Rose, I think is actually the best football that Brandon Rose has ever played. So I'm really encouraged about Brandon Rose being this year's Bryson Barnes. If Cam gets hurt, he can win a big game for Utah. Utah's not winning the Big 12 with a backup quarterback. That doesn't really happen. Guys like Tua Tagovailoa when he were at Alabama, they're rare stories for a reason. Caleb Williams coming out of nowhere when he was the backup at Oklahoma to Spencer Rattler, doesn't happen, especially places that aren't known like Utah to have. They have very good college football quarterbacks, but it's not like they're producing quarterbacks who are starters at the NFL level. And I really like Tyler Huntley. I think he's a really quality backup and one of the best quarterbacks to ever play at Utah, but I don't think he's a starter. When Cam goes on to the next level, he's obviously not going to be a starter either. So really good college quarterbacks is what Utah has established and built. And I believe they have a couple of them, whether it's also a guy like Isaac Wilson, who we got to talk about in a moment too, all the special signs and flashes that it seems like he's already showing in the spring. And Brandon, who nearly was the backup last year, just missed out, has had time to improve, grow, and get better, as Coach Whittingham has said he has in practice. And I feel good about the state of Utah's quarterback room, because I'll even go back to the first point. Once again, you're not going to get a starting caliber guy who's going to come in and be Cam Rising's backup and burn a year eligibility. These guys are in the portal because they want to play. And yes, you're not going to get a guy who is like right below Cam Rising, is in one of the 50 best quarterbacks in college football. But I think Brandon Rose and Isaac Wilson are quality backups, and I feel good about the state of Utah's quarterback room. Would love to hear what you guys think about it. Do you want to see Utah go after a transfer quarterback? Are there any quarterbacks that have caught your eye? Make sure you guys let me know down below. But let's talk a little bit more about what Brandon Rose and Isaac Wilson have seen. Well, I'm excited about the flashes, and we've talked a little bit about what Coach Whitt said, but there's been other things that have been said about those guys too. We're going to be diving into those comments that were the latest to come up from the Hill in one moment. But first, I want to talk to you all about our friends at LinkedIn Talent Solutions. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time and resources to hire. That's why they're constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process that much quicker. 2.5 million, once again, 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. And you guys can today too by going and posting your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. All caps, no spaces, Locked On College. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. So going back in and looking at the latest comments that have been made by Kyle Whittingham up on the Hill, he said something very interesting as well. This one also comes to us from Josh Furlong of KSL.com, in which Kyle Whittingham said that this year no quarterbacks will be live during the spring game, and they haven't been live all spring. It's a case-by-case situation each year, and they felt no need for it this year. I do not know Kyle Whittingham. I have not gone in. I've obviously interviewed him as in part of the press scrums and things like that before, but I've never had a one-on-one conversation with Kyle Whittingham. But I'm going to say this. I feel pretty positive. Once again, this is not inside sources or anything like that, but like, let's just be real. I think if you ask Kyle Whittingham, do you regret going live in that one scrimmage last year in which Brandon Rose got dinged up? I think the answer to that would absolutely be yes, because they really could use Brandon Rose as the season wore on. When Bryson, and like I said, Bryson still looked strong in moments, right? But there were other times where, hey, you needed to have Nate Johnson come in. Brandon Rose just would have been another option, especially by the time those guys weren't playing and you needed someone against Colorado and when Bryson was struggling against Northwestern to throw in there too. So that's where it would have been really nice to have Brandon Rose. I'm sorry. I just, as an outsider who's watching the team, I can't not believe that that's not a little bit of a regret that you had one of your quarterbacks get hurt and you really could have used him as the season wore on because you went live. I got to believe that's a big reason why this team has not had their quarterbacks go live. And I understand that you want them to get better. And the best way to do that in terms of simulating live game reps is to have the danger of getting hit. But I think that Utah understands it's more valuable to have those guys out there. You're still simulating the coverage and all the things of that nature. And I trust Andy Ludwig and the staff. Utah quarterbacks don't normally fumble because they don't run that much. I know Nate had his struggles with it at times last year, but that was more of his style to be a running quarterback. That's where he was best at. Could still make throws, but he was best when running. That's why it was frustrating in the Oregon State game when they didn't turn him loose and let him run more. But guys like Brandon last year and then Brandon Rose this year, Bryson Barnes last year. The fumbling hasn't been a huge issue for those guys. I don't expect it to be this year. So I'm okay with them not being live. Mentioned we were going to talk about Isaac Wilson a little bit more. Josh also put this out on his Twitter feed talking about what he said. KSL.com's Josh Furlong said Isaac Wilson has done a good job this spring understanding the offense and getting into the system. That comes to us from a coach from Kyle Whittingham. And just Brandon Rose said that's where he did say he played his best football as a youth this spring. So that's a big plus for us. But going back to Isaac Wilson, I just think it's awesome that he's picking up the offense this quickly. It shows you that he is motivated to try to put himself in the best position he can to get on the field right away. He obviously knows he's going to be the backup, but he's not content with being the third string guy, as when he showed up today, the first day of camp is probably where they had him. He wants to be the backup. He's competing with Brandon Rose for it. And I think that's really exciting that he's not content being the third guy, that he's already ready, that, hey, I know true freshmen don't normally play, and especially in Utah, you guys could tell me the last true freshman who was a backup quarterback outright. Like, yes, we saw Nate Johnson do it recently, but even Nate Johnson, right? This is a guy who he was the kind of the more bright, excuse me, Bryson Barnes was the backup. Nate was the guy who came in the Wildcat and all the different crazy things that Utah would do with him because he was so athletic going back to his freshman year 2 years ago. So even that one where he was like, hey, he was the third string guy. And because you just don't see yet again, you don't see freshman quarterbacks come in and compete like that versus this is an opportunity where Zach Wilson, a 4-star talent, has the ability. Excuse me, this is an opportunity for Isaac Wilson, who has the chance to do that. Isaac is going to be exciting to see what he can do. And he is someone. We'll do a list of things we're excited about in the spring game. We've already talked about it a little bit on this show, but watching Isaac live might be at the top of my list because he's a guy whose potential is uber high and can't wait to see him back inside Wistrcill Stadium where he's played a lot, of course. Another comment I found interesting, as Josh Furlong noted, said Kyle Whittingham said today that the safeties and wide receivers group had helped themselves the most in spring. Whether it's new guys or guys already in the program improving, he's pleased with those two groups. I think that's outstanding. Outside of the offensive line for Utah, as I've talked about a lot on this show, my biggest questions then were secondary and wide receivers. And after you got Dorian Singer, wide receiver wasn't a huge question, but it's always good to be deep because there's always injury. And one of those guys who was injured was Micah Pittman. And it's been awesome to hear about how strong his rapport with Cam Rising still is. The amount of times those guys have connected at practice has been really encouraging. It's been great to also just stay with the receivers. Dorian Singer, he's hit the ground running, right? Money Parks is a reliable guy. I love the moments we saw from Munir McClain last year. So those are your main 4 receivers at this moment. How is Lyons, Zipper, some of the other young, talented guys who are just transferred up or just came in for their first spring ball early, or other guys that we're not even talking about? How are some of those guys coming along? It could be a surprise. I feel good about the wide receivers at the University of Utah this year. And I know we said that last year, but also did not know that we were going to have the issue of not having Cam Rising and not getting to see the full potential of those guys because, like we talked about earlier, things go different with a backup quarterback. And that definitely was the case at Utah, even if that backup still puts you in a position to win as long as the other parts do their job and execute. But moving off of that to just talking about some of the other position groups, going over to the safeties, right? How good has Teo Johnson been? We knew he would have a chance to start at safety, but to hear that he's already like one of these starters, I think is a testament to how good he's been. And then you get guys like Gilman, Jonathan Hall, and Nate Ritchie, who are all going to play a role. Safety was a huge question after losing Cole Bishop and Sione Vaki. It's now extreme. It's 4 deep, and I feel great about all 4 guys. I'm trying not to overreact to one game, but when Jonathan Hall and Nate Ritchie played as well as they did in Northwestern, it's kind of hard not to feel pretty good about those guys. Like, yes, you still need to see them out there. They're always going to be a question, but if I was then asked, like, they're a question, do you think it's going to work out? I would say, yeah. And not just because, as we like to say on the show, in Morgan Scalley and Sharif Shaw we trust, but because I have evidence of those guys playing at a very high level in which they held a Power 4 team, albeit Northwestern's offense didn't light the world on fire, but they still held that team to just 14 points in a bowl game, which was obviously incredibly impressive too. And even though Kyle Whittingham didn't say it, of course, the corners are a big question too. It sounds like from everything we've heard up from spring ball that those guys have been doing a really good job too. So really exciting to hear all these updates from Kyle Whittingham too. Another thing I found interesting is Fan Nation All Utes noted was that Cam Rising was asked about the QB2 battle and said iron sharpens iron. And look, we're not there to see every throw at practice, but we get to see a little bit. The media does. And it sounds like from what's been said, Brandon Rose and Isaac Wilson have both been doing really good things, right? This is a guy in Rose who's been in the program for a few years. This is a guy in Wilson who was a highly touted recruit coming off a state championship inside Wistrcill Stadium itself. So these guys are going to work each and every day trying to make each other better. And not just the quarterbacks trying to push and make each other better. How about the defense they're going against, the corners, the secondary play? It's probably the best, better than they're going to see in the Big 12 this year. I could be shading a Big 12 secondary. I am not trying to do so, but I know the success rate in which Utah has at putting defensive backs in the NFL level. And I know TCU's had some success in the past of doing that too. And obviously Colorado has got a guy in Travis Hunter, who I think is spectacular as a receiver too. Matter of fact, of course, but I still think Utah is the place for DBs. So great opportunity for those guys to get reps here. And I'm sure the one that you guys were all excited about, especially if you follow Fan Nation All Utes, was they did put out that Cam Rising said he's chomping at the bit to play BYU in 2024. Cam Rising is a Utah legend, but it is crazy to think the one thing that he hasn't done is beat BYU, because you look back and that was kind of the last straw. And I know he started against San Diego State, right? But the Charlie Brewer thing, that was the last straw, was against BYU. And then the next 2 years, obviously, with Cam not even playing this year, it didn't matter. Utah missed BYU, unfortunately. So I'm excited to see Cam have the opportunity to add to his already extremely loaded trophy case as a Utah quarterback, a potential win over Utah's rival in BYU, which unfortunately is not going to be played on rivalry weekend, but we are still glad and happy just to have it back all the same. So loved hearing Cam talk about that, and we'll definitely talk about that in the near future too. But going to be fun to get Utah versus BYU coming this fall. That's going to do it for our football talk. Got a ton of football content still coming this week with the spring game set for Saturday. All the great interviews and quotes we've been hearing from everyone. I am excited to continue to break that down on the show. Ryan McDonald of the Deseret News will be joining me tomorrow. But before we get out of here today, got to talk to you guys about what the Utah Gymnastics team has been able to do. But before we dive into that, I want to talk to you all about one of the sponsors of today's episode of Locked On Utes, our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on the app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And speaking of America's #1 sportsbook, how many great games in action is there to get in on? This is where NBA teams, I know there's always the thing, how hard do the NBA teams play? Well, they're giving it all they got right now because they want to miss the play-in game. They're jockeying for position in the standings. These are the NBA games you're going to want to lock in on. I know one team I've got my eye on is the Lakers with LeBron, always going to draw headlines. How are they going to finish up the season? Had a tough loss to the Warriors tonight. That's where it's going to be fun to see how it all ends up concluding for them. But if you guys want to get in all the great action, make sure you head over to FanDuel Sportsbook today. Real quick before we get out of here, got to talk about Utah Gymnastics and what they just did this past weekend at the Gainesville Regional. It was incredible. And I don't use that word lightly because it was actually historic. They made history. This comes to us from the Utah Athletics website. Utah was the 5th ranked team in the country, had to go to the Gainesville Regional. And if you got to be one of the top 2 teams in order to advance to nationals. And they did that by punching. They had a huge performance. They rallied late. They were down, but came up and stepped up late when they needed it most. And on bars is where we really saw Utah with Miley O'Keefe, as she's done so many times throughout her Utah career. And of course, we know she crushed it on the beam too with that 995. And you get contributions like her really stepping up for this Utah team, as well as as well as competitors like Grace McCallum, Amelia Morgan, Zerbies, McKenna Smith. And I could go on and on about this Utah Gymnastics team, but really what is crazy is that they did make the late comeback in there and punch their ticket to their historic 48th consecutive NCAA national championship meet. That's a record. They're the only team to compete in every national championship. I will say that again. Utah Gymnastics is the only team to compete in every single national championship tournament. 48 straight. No signs of slowing down either with the recruits and the talent they bring in. So just absolutely tremendous. All the credit in the world to this team for clutching up and when they needed it most, stepping up as they always do, right? I mean, we know how good players like Jaden Rucker, Ashlyn Gill, and all these sensational stars, Abby Polson, Jalen Gilstrap. The Utah Gymnastics team is loaded, and they weren't their best for the entirety of the meet, but they stepped up late, beat a top 15 team. Missouri was ranked 13th in the final rotation. Was Utah pulled ahead, and they're still able to now compete for a national championship, which is just tremendous. Can't wait to see what they're able to do coming up. We'll definitely be talking about it a lot here. Got a shout out to Coach Carly Dockendorf, the head coach. Look, it's been a lot. There was a lot that happened this offseason, a lot of noise and everything. The Utah Athletic Department did their best to handle everything and go forward from there. But Coach Dockendorf and these players, what they were able to do once again, navigating all that turmoil, it's extremely impressive and tremendous, and they have to be commended for it. So congrats to the Utah Gymnastics team. We'll be covering nationals once it comes around. Not till April 18th, so we got a little bit of time. But once again, Miley O'Keefe and the squad get it done in the Gainesville Regional, and they're moving on. Florida, of course, also moving on too. So It's going to be tough because you got Oklahoma, Florida, Alabama, who are all going to be competing in their NCAA semifinals, but just tremendous to know that Utah is yet again among the best of the best for the 48th straight season. Absolutely tremendous stuff by the Red Rocks, and we'll be covering it more on Locked On Utes. But that's going to do it for our show today. We thank you, as always, for tuning in and joining us and making us your first listen of the day. And we look forward to seeing you back with us tomorrow.